UNEP, UNU Merit, WIPO, UN-ESQA, UN-EC, UN-ECLAC, UN-ECA, UN-ESCAP, and a sort of a refresher in our organization, we have the European Commission, the Joint Research Council with us also today. The objective of the Workstream 6 is to design and deliver training courses, workshops, and training materials on STI policy for SDGs, with a primary focus on developing countries. For more information, you may visit the link that is in the slide. Of course, all the PowerPoints and the slides will be distributed at the end of the sessions. So, for those who have been here already, you know what has happened in the last 3 days. For those who haven't, on day 1, we had a discussion on current approaches to STI policy, making in the context of SDGs. On session 2, we had STI policy instruments designed for SDGs. On session 3, we discussed innovation and entrepreneurship. And today, this is the 4th session, and we're probably discussing what is one of the most important and issues in policy making, that is the implementation of STI policy instruments. As many of us know who have been in the STI policy area for many years, it is all well to design an STI policy and to actually have it promulgated in Parliament or whatever the process is in countries. But it comes to the implementation and to the development and activation of various STI policy instruments and tools, then we hit on some problems. And this is probably the main challenge for STI policy. So we'll be looking at a number of things today. Tomorrow we'll follow up with one of the key facets of policy design and implementation, that is the monitoring and evaluation of STI policies. But before we get to that, we have to go through some of the fundamental issues on STI policy implementation. Today with us we have 3 excellent presenters. So I will introduce them one by one. The first one is Ludovico Alcorta. Ludovico is a professorial fellow on technology, innovation, and sustainable development at UNU Merit School of Business and Economics at the University of Maastricht. He has been Director of Industrial Policy, Statistics, and Strategic Research at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, where he contributed to the preparation of SDGs 8 and 9. Ludo holds a master's and PhD in development from the University of Sussex. Our second presenter will be Monica Matusiak. She holds a PhD in economics and is head of Smart Specialization Global Reach Office at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. She's the focal point for the UN-IATT within the JRC, coordinating the application of smart specialization strategies for achieving SDGs. Before joining the European Commission, she worked at the World Bank and as Director of Public Policy at the Center for Knowledge Transfer, University of Economics and Business in Poznan, Poland. Her research interests include national and regional innovation, transformative innovation policies, and innovation for sustainability. And last but not least, we have Victor Conde. He's a Scientific Affairs Officer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in the Technology and Innovation section. He holds a PhD in biochemistry and is a postdoctoral alumnus of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He's the founder of the African Technology Development Forum, managing partner of the ATDF Entrepreneurship Hub in Lusaka, Zambia. He is also fellow of the World Academy of Arts. Victor has over 30 years of postgraduate work experience in the private and public sectors. His current areas of interest and expertise include promotion of innovation and entrepreneurship policies and strategies, intellectual asset management, technology transfer, innovation funding models, and development of business models, especially for the youth. In the support roles, we have myself, Dimo Chalowski. Some of you may have been present yesterday for one of my presentations, as well as Zhengmei Wang and Despina Susoni, who are doing all those necessary things behind the scenes to make these presentations happen and are also with us today. The structure of session 4, we have already in fact started it with the welcome remarks and introduction to STI policy instruments session. We will move on to the first presentation on implementation challenges, which will be delivered by Ludovico. We will have some surveys and open discussion, and then we will move on to the case studies, which will be delivered by Monica and Victor. Afterwards, we will again have some surveys and open discussion, and then we will have a summary session and then some takeaway messages. We'll be using, of course, we're on Zoom, so all of you, I suppose, after this year and a half of various COVID-related problems are probably familiar with Zoom. I plead with you all that at the beginning of the meeting and during the discussions to please keep your camera on if your internet connection is good. However, during the presentations of other speakers, please keep your camera off. Also, please keep your microphone off when you are not speaking. If you wish to raise the floor, please raise your hand and unmute yourself when the floor is given to you. Feel free to use the chat for asking questions and sharing comments. Our team behind the scenes is monitoring the chat all the time and will pass questions for the panelists when the situation permits. We will be using a tool called Mentimeter. And these are, it's a very easy tool to use. I suppose most of you have had some experience with this by now. The way to participate in is to follow the link that is in the chat. It will be announced, and you will be guided towards that. In due course, you will fill in your responses, and for the large majority of the questions, you will see the responses developing on screen, which is a very useful and engaging experience, because often our prejudgments do not match what is happening in the entire group. With that, I finish with the outline, and before we start, I'd like to, in order to get a better feeling of the participants, and to see who is where with what, and in terms of their experience in the particular topic of this session, I would like to invite my colleagues Despina and Zengmi to start with the first Mentimeter question. And I would ask first of you to specify which country please specify the country where your institution is located in. So please go to the link in the actual chat and please fill in your country name. We'd like to get an impression of the geographic scope of who we're talking to. Okay, thank you for those responses. We'd like to move on now to the second Mentimeter question, and this is really an important question. It's very important for the presenters in order to get a feel of your previous experience. So what is your level of knowledge related to STI policy instrument implementation? Have you done any policy work in this area, and what have been your experiences on the implementation side? There are 43 participants in the room, and we only have 7 responses. I think we can do a little bit better than that. Please go to the Mentimeter link and tell us what is your level of involvement for the topic today. Thank you. Please, 30 more seconds for this question. Please click on the link in the chat and please respond to this question. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So we have a nice breakdown here. We have a number of people who have been involved in. We have 1 expert. So our panelists will have some competition here. They're all experts in their own way, but it's also good that that we have people who for whom this is the first time in this actual theme. It is important in the sense that all the themes that we're presenting on during this week are interconnected to a high level, and that one cannot be familiar with one and have gaps in others. It's really a good idea to have a good coverage of all the themes. So Ludo, I think you have taken note as well of the Mentimeter responses here. So we have quite a few people who have been involved in the implementation processes, and I'm sure you will have an interesting response from them after your presentation. Having said that, Ludo, please, off to you, and please start your presentation. Thank you.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet.
Can you see it? Can you see the presentation?
No.
No.
No. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, let me do this again, sorry. Okay. All right, I have to do this first. Bear me for a second. Share screen now. Can you see it now?
It's coming.
Presentation. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Just come.
Okay. All right.
No, but there we go. It's there.
Yeah.
Okay, Ludo, you're good to go.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Is it slide 1 now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. As Dimo introduced me, I'm Ludovico Alcorta, Professor and Fellow in Sustainable Technology and Innovation for Sustainable Development. I think the objective of this presentation is twofold. On the one hand, describe some what are the key implementation challenges that are faced in many places. Actually, I'm making this presentation a lot from experience because I was involved recently in actually industrial policy rather than technology policy advisory role in for a government. And many of these reflections arise from my personal experiences too. So I'm not only sharing let's say, academic work, but also practical experience that I have. Okay, so let me begin with the first slide, if it moves. No, it doesn't. Next. Okay. We start with which stage of the STI policy and what is implementation. Implementation is essentially about executing or operationalizing the policy instruments that we have designed in the previous stage. The policy cycle has 4 stages: problem identification, design. The third stage is implementation. Next stage is evaluation and assessment. We can also include a monitoring stage if you think that that's also necessary. What are the characteristics of the implementation stage? I think that the most important characteristic of the implementation stage include first that it is a proof of concept. Okay, when you develop new products, you develop it in the lab, you develop it in the company, and then the next stage is the proof of concept. You take it to the real world and you test it there. Implementation, in a way, is about testing the ideas of the policy instruments that we have designed in offices, essentially. It's also about learning. It's about trying, testing, and adapting to the challenges that reality imposes. Labs, offices, and reality are very different, and one has to adapt to the conditions that our policy instruments face in the real world. And that is the implementation process of adaptation, of learning to the real world conditions. It is also a social, political, and managerial process. It is social because it involves very different stakeholders, and very different stakeholders whose behavior has to change. It's political because these stakeholders have interests. They have interests and they have representation, they have power, and they will exercise that power in the process of implementation. And it's a managerial exercise too, because we have to allocate resources and make decisions. And because it's a constant interaction with reality, there has to be a lot of decisions to be taken during the process. It is also a communication exercise because one has to bring the population and the stakeholders onto the process. One has to involve them, one has to get the commitment, one has to get the acceptance. And in order to do that, one has to communicate, one has to convince them. Just think of the recent COVID pandemic, the number of people that still oppose vaccination and sometimes for very good reasons. So, for the common good, one has to convince them that it's necessary for. And that process of convincing and communications is crucial to the implementation stage. And finally, as I mentioned a second ago, it's a change process. As a change process, it involves people changing their behavior. And people resist changing behavior. People don't like to change behavior. People oppose changing behavior. And therefore, one has to, again, to convince them, to bring them on board, to commit them into the process. And all this is a completely different exercise than the one you have in policy design, which is much more technical. This is no longer a technical process. This is a political, social, and managerial process, essentially. And the skills required for this process are of that type. Okay, the number of challenges that one has to address when we think about implementing. The first challenge, and one would like to have must have in mind, is, of course, one has to do good planning. And good planning involves preparing first a roadmap. A roadmap just describes operational, long-term, short-term operational actions that are necessary to implement policies. Within the roadmap, you also have to have, or together with the roadmap, you have to have a calendar where you set stages and you describe what does each stage need, what needs to be done in each stage. And you also put a gate at the end. And a gate essentially means is, okay, to move to the next stage, I have to achieve certain results. Okay, and that is what you put in a gate. So you move from one stage, you interact with certain results of that stage, and you move to the next stage, and so on and so on. Each of these stage and gates must have time allocated to it, and must have clear deadlines. It's also necessary to have very, very well-defined roles and responsibilities at every level. at every level, all the way up from the ministry to the civil servant actually following the policies. At every level, we need to have very clear responsibilities, and everybody has to be answerable for those responsibilities. Of course, one has to allocate human and financial resources to it, but I'll get back to this later. Each stage and each operational action must have a measurable set of and realistic set of STI performance indicators, which don't only have to be indicating indicators at the end of the process, but you must build a set of indicators that are intermediate indicators and final indicators, so you can follow the process properly. Every planning also involves costing, but costing is not only about costing the content. So how much is this measure going to cost? If you're going to give a subsidy, how much money you have to put into the subsidy? We often tend to forget that you also have to cost and invest in the process, in the implementation process. I've seen very often policy instruments whose budgets allocate only money for this instrument and no money for the process of implementation. And that's a big error. And finally, the planning process has to have a social media and press strategy. Nowadays, without social media and without the press strategy, you cannot move forward in any implementation process. And I think the recent pandemic illustrates this very well. One also must have a systems approach. In order to implement properly, one has to look into all the different elements and try to work with all the different elements of the system and interact with them. To begin with, one has to have a very clear idea of the current overall social, economic, and political environment, and how is it changing, and how to adapt to a changing environment. Secondly, one has to identify the right kinds of input. Sometimes the best input for achieving, for implementing an instrument is a law. Sometimes it's a regulation. Other times it's a project. One has to identify the exact input that will help us to achieve the outputs or the behavioral outcomes that one is pursuing. Also, one has to identify and work with the precise STI actors. And here I do not mean when you talk about the stakeholder, you must not talk of it in terms of generic terms. If you want to work with the private sector, it's not the private sector one has to talk, but which firms in that private sector, which specific actor is one that one has to work with. And that's what I mean by a granular perspective. It's the private sector, but specific actors that have a bearing on the policies. One has to identify also the social and economic and political interactions between the stakeholders and how may that affect the implementation process, and also assess the repercussions of the actions one is taking over all these actors. Yeah, because in assessing and understanding the repercussions that they may have on the actors, one will be able to implement perfect, because some reactions that the stakeholder has may not be positive, they may be negative, so one has to deal with that. And one has to address all the above interactions, the context, the actors, the regulations, and the repercussions, and one has to have an overall systemic approach to this, because all these variables are really interrelated in implementation, and one has to act over all of them. The next challenge one faces in implementation tends to be the leadership and commitment. I often say, and from experience, I've noticed that if there is not top presidential or parliamentary priority for a specific STI action, it's always very difficult to implement. You need top level priority, and it has to be at the presidential level, at the ministerial level. The minister has to be in line with the president has to be in line with the parliament, and for an STI policy instrument to be implemented. If you do not get top commitment, then it will be very difficult to implement that policy. We also need in both in the public and private sectors champions. Champions are those people that sell the policies, that promote policies, that work in different ministries, are constantly promoting the policies that you want to implement. And the role of champions is very important because they are your salespeople for the policies. Those are the ones that actually market the policies. You also have to draw on the STI bureaucracy. The role of the STI bureaucracy is to influence their colleagues, their friends in other ministries, their colleagues in other ministries, and to advocate for the policy. We need constantly to work on leadership and commitment. One of the problems that emerges normally in implementation is after a while, the steam starts running out and people and the leadership and the bureaucracy and the champions start losing steam. And that has to be kept. You have to keep the level, the intensity of the process at the same level to avoid it losing steam. And you do this by working with committed personnel. Identify those people that are committed to the policies and use them to work with them in order to keep the level of interest going, the implementation process running. And always have a lead ministry or a body that proactively runs a process. We talk about secretariats. Yes, secretariats are necessary, but they have to be secretariats that proactively push the process. If they're just reactive, then you will not get the right movement. Of course, another challenge also refers to governance. And when we talk about governance, we're talking about here always having an overall representative STI multi-stakeholder consulting or decision-making instance. Sometimes you may have a consulting overall multi-stakeholder group, or you may have a decision-making group that is multi-stakeholder or multi-representative. It depends on the specific set of policies and the specific set of instruments, but you always need one or the other. This body, if it's a decision-making body, must have the overall responsibility for implementation. Can be a department, a directorate, or can be a committee created specifically for this purpose. Again, this committee must have very clear responsibilities and duties, clearly identify structures and tasks that are fit for purpose, and should be connected to the individual functions of specialization of the different individuals or institutions involved. For me, one of the most important elements in the implementation process is the creation and the implementation of teams. Teams can be either inter or inter-organizational teams, but these are the executioners of the implementation process. They actually run the process, and the better, the wider the teams, the more inter-organizational, interdisciplinary you have the teams, the better, because in the end, they are the drivers of implementation process. In order to have good governance, you also must provide full information, and you have to always implement processes and relate and rules of these processes that are clear and transparent to all those involved. Obscure processes, poor information never lead to good implementation, because just people don't know what to expect, don't know what to do. It's always better to provide full information and to have very, very clear and transparent rules. Coordination. Another challenge that we all normally face in implementation is coordination. I was working in a Gulf country in some industrial policies there, and we identified around 1,064 actions that were required for implementing an industrial strategy. 1,064 actions, of which only 242 of them were implementable by the Ministry of Industry. All the others were implemented by other ministries. Worse even, if we looked at the amount of expenditure that was required for implementing these policies, only 8% was implemented in the Ministry of Industry. 92% was implemented in other ministries. Without coordination, without other ministries, nothing can be implemented. And furthermore, in most cases, the success of a policy does not depend on the ministry which has the responsibility, but depends on the other ministries. Therefore, creating multi-stakeholders, committees, working groups, and teams is fundamentally important for this to work. If you do not work with team, if other ministries are not involved, policies are not going to be successful. And you have to bring the relevant individuals and organizations to these instances. If it's about SDGs, I suggest, and some people have suggested to me in the past, that you have to include the UNDP office or different UN agencies when we're trying to connect to SDGs. Always rotate the responsibilities across all stakeholders involved. The reason for this is very simple. By rotating responsibilities, you create commitment and you create ownership. So it always is good practice to rotate responsibilities, rotate leadership, rotate some leading roles for people to be able to take commitment and ownership. Always have focal points. Of course, we interact with other people, with other colleagues through our friendship and personal links, but it's always important to create focal points, people that functionally responsible for the activities of implementation. Nowadays,
4 minutes.
Okay. Nowadays, you cannot work without. Nowadays, you cannot work without social media. In order to be successful in implementation, you have to work with social media and media in general, and always have a campaign aimed at presenting the rationale, informing the public, encouraging debate. That is the way that you generate commitment and involvement in the population. Use media, design, and allocate resources to media. I said earlier that implementation is essentially a managerial process. It is so because you are dealing with competing demands. It's unpredictable, it's uncertain, it involves resistance, it entails lots of practical difficulties, and you have to take decisions. It's a process of constantly taking decisions. And for these, technical people are not that good at taking decisions. Managers, that's what they pay them for. So you have to identify managers and the right STI managers that can run the process, the implementation process. Saying they have a very key role in this process. And you need a number of capabilities here. Of course, technical expertise, but I would emphasize not so much the content expertise, but the process expertise. People experience or managers experiences in running processes. They must have holistic thinking, there must be problem-solving capabilities, they must be able to communicate and to convince them if it's trustworthy. But it's managers that have to do this. And of course, make the adequate use of implementation vehicles or managerial tools. In terms of resources, again, any policy instrument must come accompanied by the right amount of resources. Don't start any policy instrument if you don't have the resources. It's better not to do it because in the end, you take away the legitimacy of an instrument if it is not accompanied by the right amount of resources. But, and I said this earlier, and I re-emphasize it again, make sure that you have resources also allocated for implementation process. Yeah, you need consultants, you need studies, interviews, travel, meetings, software, communication, press, social media. You must have resources for this. Well, you have to obtain the right mix of STI human resources, managers, experts, support staff, very important communication professionals. Nowadays, without communication, you do not succeed. And you must have attained the required knowledge, work with the epistemic community, look into your policy research, consult internationally, consult consultants in companies, international organizations, etc. 2 more slides and I'll finish here. This was emphasized very much yesterday by Nicolo in how they had, the startup Chile had evolved over time. And what he essentially was saying is that STI policy implementation, and actually this feeds back into design, the design process was the result of a continuous implementation process, involves a process of learning by doing and learning from experiences from experience and mistakes done by others. In terms of learning by doing, terms of learning by doing, take very, very much into account what are the contextual conditions that you're facing. Adapt to them. Always be test alternative approaches. And it came out very clearly in the experience of Startup Chile, how they were getting a challenge, testing it, coming up with new solutions, coming up with new challenges, new solutions, and that's the process of learning by doing. And the next thing is also learning by experience. Codify. It's horrible to write reports and codify everything you want. It's a lot. We think it's a lot of waste of time. But codifying our experience, writing, reporting is always useful for others and for the next generations. And here I will finish. Many of the implementation recommendations that I mentioned are already in place in many countries. Many of you may have them. Now, depending on the extent of institutional involvement, the proposals will be more or less relevant to your respective countries. But every country, normally has challenges of implementation. How to apply these suggestions will depend on what policy mix are you trying to implement. For policy mixes that are complex, that involve high-level objectives, you probably need to apply the whole set of recommendations made here. For policies that are less complex, maybe you can just select a few of the aspects that I mentioned. The implementation policy instruments always involves multifaceted processes. Although the complexity, and this is something I want to emphasize, lies more on social policy, political and managerial processes than in the technicalities of the instruments. This is essentially a social, political, and managerial process. And that is what you have to focus on, not so much on the technicalities of the instruments. Finally, don't cut corners. Trying to cut corners or to reduce the length of implementation process for political expedience, will only derail the implementation process and result in failure of the policy instrument. Implementation processes need to be given the time that they take. Without giving them the time that they take, for sure, implementation will not be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludo, for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure that many of us can identify with so many of the things you said and that you pointed out. Before we proceed to a brief Q&A, can we put up the first Mentimeter question for this presentation? Despina. So the first question is what is the major cause of STI policy implementation failure in your country? So don't be shy, your answers will remain anonymous, but please let us know which one of the four possibilities it is. We have given one, a lack of political will, two, stakeholder apathy, three, limited funding, and four, fragmentation of efforts as possible causes of implementation failure. Let us know what you think. Click on the link in the chat. Thank you very much. Okay, let's give it another 30 seconds for this question. Okay, thank you very much. Can we move on to the second question following Ludo's presentation, and that is, which policy instrument is more difficult to implement in your country? You can choose 3 of the possible options. No, sorry, apologies for that. Sorry. So the second question is, who are the main STI policy implementation stakeholders in your country? Despina, can you post the second question? Regarding the previous question, I thought it was interesting that the responses were very varied. The only constant there seemed to have been the notion of fragmentation. Earlier on, the issue of funding rose, but then I think that collaboration and coordination took over from funding as often noted problem with policy implementation. Ludo, did you notice something similar?
Sorry, what
Well, on the first question, when the responses started coming in, funding was the one of the main concerns, along with fragmentation of policy. But later on, as the questionnaire went on, we yes, the collaboration and coordination problems arose to be, but it was a very diverse type of response. Okay.
I just thank you on that point. As I mentioned, I was involved in developing and implementing some policies in a country in the Gulf area, right. And I got once I was discussing with the secretary about. I explained, look, in order to get these policies implemented, we need to work with this and that's in this other ministry. And the reply I got from the undersecretary was as follows: I don't want to hear anything except the things that we can do. Don't tell me anything except the things that we can do. And I said, well, but yeah, whatever you can do will not be enough in order to achieve your objectives. To achieve your objectives, you need to work with somebody, with all the others. And I showed the figures that I had there and said, look, only 8% of the expenditure required to implement what you want to achieve is done by your ministry. 92% is done by other ministries. You cannot achieve anything without coordination. And I'm not sure I won the argument, but I certainly made it very forcefully. The silo mentality that is mentioned there, it's very rampant across all governments, by the way. And I just mentioned, I was once involved in South Korea with the Minister of Industry there. And it's same problem that you face in developing countries, you face in South Korea. Same silo mentality, lack of work, lack of coordination, lack of communication across ministries, etc. Exactly the same problem. it is not a problem only in developing countries, it's a problem of bureaucracy. It's a problem of governments. Now, some governments deal with it better than others, but it is rampant everywhere. And I think that is, for me, very, very revealing. One of the things I learned over years, that addressing this issue is takes you a long way to solve implementation problems. It's not only money or.
Right. Ludo, would you like to comment on the results of question number 4 about the stakeholders?
Indeed, yeah, you see, it's interesting. The main stakeholders are ministries here, and for me, the main implemented of any STI policy should be the private sector. Because in the end, from an innovation perspective, it is the firms that actually are going to eventually deliver the goods, the new products, the new processes, the technological breakthroughs. And we tend to, of course, the ministries have a leading role. They initiate the policies. In that sense, they are important. But I would have expected also an equally important role in implementation to the private sector. And and this is common, by the way. This is a common problem in that from government, we see science and technology innovation, general, and science and technology innovation implementation as a government problem, or as a university problem, or as a relationship problem between universities and government. Yeah. When the problem is, the problem is the private sector. The problem is that it is that firms that have to innovate. It's them that have to take a leading role. We have a very much a science approach to STI rather than an innovation or technology approach to STI. I think you said it the other day too. The S is in uppercase, whereas the T and the I are in lowercase. And we need to rebalance this. Now, that also means that the private sector has to take a much more active, proactive, and leadership role in these processes, which they don't.
They do not,
okay?
no.
So we also need them to take a much more important leadership role.
I mean, I can sympathize, with this perspectives. Doing STI policy reviews, we tend to have a lot of meetings with private sector entities just to see what is the feeling on the other side. And it's interesting when you ask firms and entrepreneurs, they don't really want to interact with governments because they see them as I don't want to say hostile entities, but as far as many firms are concerned, their biggest concern is how much they are taxed and then what is expected of them. And I think the common ground, for discussion between the ministries and the agencies and the private sector, I think that's part of the initiative that, in fact, the government has to take to establish this common ground. The private sector won't work towards it itself because it has other stuff to do, which is usually just making money. So that's not the objective of a firm, or is not to establish common ground with the government. But it is an arduous task, and often the academia and the government, somehow they manage to find a common language, but the private sector is usually left out of the equation most of the time, even if it is declared not to be in the actual STI policy. In the design phase, it's okay, in the implementation phase, not so much. Ludo, there's a question that came up in the chat, and it was from Muchaneta, and the question was, most policies fail at the implementation stage. A number of reasons have been preferred. What are your thoughts on this? I think key reasons for failure.
Well, that was what the presentation was about.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Look, if you ask me to, I think all the reasons that I gave, I think lack of planning, lack of understanding of the process, lack of use of media, of involvement of the population, poor coordination, poor governance, all this. But I think I think that one that the government can act better on, and I think that that would be it's most responsible for directly trying to solve the problem is that the coordination issue. The coordination issue for me is fundamental. I've seen it in all too many governments. The lack of communication and coordination across entities, and that's for me something that is not. You cannot blame the private sector for that. You can only blame the government for that, and that's something that is in the power of the government and the government institutions to address. And I think that if I won't say that I would say that you need to address all the problems. You cannot address one and solve and be successful in implementation because that won't work. You need to address all of them. It's a systemic problem. It's not. However, what I would say that if you have to start somewhere, yeah, I would start in the addressing the coordination issue because it's something that is within the reach of governments. It is possible to do it. Of course, it needs some behavioral changes of the organizations involved, institutions involved, but it's something that can be done within the powers of government, and there are known techniques to do it. It's not that we do not know the solution to the problem. It's just that improving implementation is a problem.
Yeah. Perhaps the participants, so we had one question. Would anyone like to take the floor and take this opportunity to ask Ludo or share some of their experiences in policy implementation, failure or not so good implementation at least? Please, the floor is open. Please raise your hand if you want to take the floor. Okay, we have Remy. Remy, please go ahead. Turn on your camera and your sound.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor to share my thoughts and experience on that question about what could be like the causes or reasons for policy implementation challenges. I don't want to use the word failure, just challenges mainly because at times the experience, I worked in the policy space for 10 years prior to joining my further studies at the University College London. At the moment, I was involved in the policy space in the government of Rwanda. So one of the lessons I learned were that policy implementation challenges may, in most cases, really stem from the way the policy was designed. At times, the policy might be designed to solve a wrong problem, and as such, you won't really achieve its expected outcomes. The other main reason, from my experience, is it could be the lack of stakeholder engagement right at the design process. By the time you design a process, a policy, and you don't really exhaust or involve stakeholders at the beginning of designing the process itself by shaping together the problem, and then you just want the stakeholders to implement the policy, you definitely expect a pushback. And I've really had some similar experiences when I was involved in STI policy back in my country. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy. Can we give the floor to Muchaneta? And then Ludo, maybe you want to comment on both of these replies. Muchaneta, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. So I haven't been involved in politics, but I'm just, upon reflection after the presentation, now I'm just realizing that we had, in my country, we had this very good policy which sought to address most of the challenges prevailing in the country. So it had a huge budget. I think it was like 3 billion I think. So it was supposed to extend for about 5 years to be implemented over a period of 5 years. But you realize that after the end of the period, the 5-year period, nothing had been done. And I'm just thinking from what has been said, some of the challenges or reasons for that failure to implement that good policy could have been to do with lack of resources. Yes, it was budgeted for, it was costed, the activities were costed, but there were no resources to implement the different activities. As well as I think also another reason could be to do with coordination, which has been alluded to earlier. There was no coordination. The cuts across different sectors, agriculture, mining, all those different sectors. But I can say now that that coordination was taken among the different sectors. Maybe the other have been lack of stakeholder engagement. I'm thinking this policy was done during the period when we're moving towards elections, and it was like a party thing. So it was really developed by the government as a party policy, which was then, I think, translated to a government blueprint, economic blueprint. So that lack of stakeholder engagement could also have led to the lack of implementation of the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Muchneta. Shall we give the floor to Bongive now? Please, let's hear your discussion. Bongive, the floor is yours. Please turn on your microphone and your camera, Bongive. Yes, no? Okay. Anyone else would like to take the floor at this point? Oh, Ludo, would you like to make some closing comments before we move on to the next presentation?
Yes. Yeah, on the stakeholder, the first question, stakeholder involvement in design. Here's the Bongiwe.
Bongive.
On the design, yes, stakeholder involvement is necessary at different stages at all stages of the policy process. The kind of stakeholder involvement that you need is different, I would say. The stakeholder involvement that you need in the implementation is more political, more social and political than technical. You need these are political processes where interests are at play, and you have power plays here. So you must build your coalition of support. You must supporters are behind you. All these aspects of stakeholder involvement are what are specific to the implementation process, which are slightly different from the design process. But I agree fully that you need stakeholder involvement in design too, because you have to involve those people that are going to be subjects of the policies. On the issue of learning I think it was very clear that very often you see policy instruments or solutions for non-existent problems. Okay, and I think what I was trying to address that issue is that the implementation process is also a learning process. And that came out again very clearly in the Startup Chile experience, where they were constantly adapting to the new demands and the new changes. You can get a policy instrument very wrong because for lack problems of design, etc., or for many reasons, because you didn't anticipate a profound change in the conditions that you face. Well, okay, but that doesn't mean that you have to stick to the initial policy instrument or the initial thinking. You have to adapt. You have to learn how things are changing and adapt your instrument. And to address that issue, I think that one has to understand implementation not only as a doing process, but also as a learning by doing process. And that's the aspect that I would include in implementation. Regarding the question of nothing can be done, yes, lack of resources. Yeah, I've seen that also, where you budget something but you don't disperse anything. So you budget several $1 billion for a policy and don't disperse it. It's better not to start a policy that is not going to get disbursement. You will just kill all the legitimacy of policy making and legitimacy of any future instrument in that respect. If there's no disbursement, just kill the instrument. Don't start it. Coordination, stakeholder involvement. The issue of different parties with these different agendas and party. As soon as a new party comes, everything changes. It's an issue that has to be addressed in a different way. There must be some understanding between different parties on certain development aspects. You have to reach certain agreements. STI is an area that can reach consensus much easily than other areas. Innovation, science, there are areas there where we can reach across party lines relatively easier than in other areas. So in order to avoid these stop-go policies that happen very often due to changes in the political arena, what I would try is to build, in addition to specific policies by each party, to try to find a consensus on certain aspects of science and technology across the board and build on those.
Thank you, Ludo. I think we need to move on. Yes,
okay.
we will. Bongive has written his question, but we'll come back to it at the closing of the session. Perhaps it will be interesting also for Monica and Victor to respond to it. Okay. So with this, we move on to the next phase of today's session, and here we will have a presentation on the Smart Specialization Implementation Framework by Monica. Monica, the floor is yours. If you can somehow get through it a bit faster, we're running about 15 minutes behind time at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I do my best to go on. I try to share my screen first. Yeah, is that okay?
That's okay. You're in the
Perfect. Yeah.
Almost full screen mode.
Yeah, I was trying to look and recognize maybe some names from the previous session because I was already speaking a little bit of what we consider as a part of implementation, which was design of the policy mix for smart specialization strategies. Today, I want to focus on what we call implementation framework that we developed at the specific request of the countries beyond European Union that we work with, and they don't have implementation structures such as those in the EU. But just in case there is someone who joined only for this specific session, I will just remind you what smart specialization is. We call them originally in the EU knowledge-based economic transformation agendas that in the recent years with all the global challenges with sustainability challenges and SDGs are more and more reoriented not only towards using science, technology, innovation for economic growth and jobs, but also for any kind of societal or environmental challenges to use innovative solutions to also answer and respond to them. So the implementation framework, we really think that without implementation, there is no strategy document. We have, I think each of us who was ever involved in any kind of policy making process can remember one or two strategies that took a lot of time to develop, that created maybe high expectations, but then finally they were just printed and put on the shelf, and no one ever did anything else with them. For us, indeed, in smart specialization, it is crucial that the implementation follows. The implementation has to be already included. The implementation kind of organigram in a way has to be included in the strategy document that every European region or country submits to European Commission for assessment. And we also use a similar kind of process with countries beyond EU who use our methodology and approach. And here you can see kind of a summary slide or a picture that shows what we consider most important elements of implementation. This work was done by few key experts from different European Union member states, but also with experience of working beyond Europe. When we ask them, please show us on a few pages what is the minimum required for any good implementation of smart specialization strategy. And here you can see what they came up with. First, you have a few blocks. My presentation today will focus on this green one, on governance of implementation, but you can also see that some other parts are considered important parts of the implementation process, such as design of specific instruments, refinement of policy mix, and monitoring and evaluation. Here I won't put much time because we already discussed it on the previous session, and there will be one more on monitoring and evaluation. But I just want to mention that if you heard me speaking during session 2 about how we design policy mix and what we understand by policy mix and smart specialization concept, this was at the time of the strategy design in a way. So obviously, when you want to achieve some goals and objectives, you have to plan specific actions, specific policy instruments. And in our approach, they really have to form a very coherent logic of public intervention. The truth is that whatever you plan in the strategy, when you get to implementation phase, there is many more detailed questions. Yeah? We want to have innovation vouchers for companies, but then someone has to sit and design those vouchers. And the process of design is not included really in the strategy document. So when we say here in the implementation framework of the need to design specific instruments, and then during this application, need of constant refinement and learning from monitoring and evaluation, this is a little bit later phase that that includes really very specific work on something that can be put in practice in reality, and sometimes differs a little bit from the original plans that we had. But what I want to focus on, as I said, this is this governance of implementation. And I think already in the discussion and what Ludo said and what Dimo said before me today, I think it's obvious for us that any strategy needs leadership, but also needs coordination and constant review and updating, which are very important for the acceptance and also the adaptation to the changing environment that we have constantly. On the leadership and coordination, I will give you some examples in this presentation, but just to remind you, for us, smart specialization, what we consider priority domains for investments in research and innovation, they are interdisciplinary. And here, there is always a question, who should be the leader? Because many of the instruments, I think Ludo also mentioned it today, they don't fall under Ministry of Education and Science or Ministry of Technology or Ministry of Innovation, however it is organized in any country. Very often there is Ministry of Economy, of Industry, sometimes of Environment, of Agriculture, of Finance that have other portfolio of instruments that are also necessary. And in this kind of interministerial cooperation schemes, we very often end up, especially beyond EU, with the leadership at the highest level, sometimes Prime Minister or Vice Prime Minister, depending where we work. And obviously the coordination mechanism, it normally includes a little bit more of interministerial discussion discussion, and management and operational team. And here you can see those gray, I hope it's well visible to you, those gray boxes, they are those elements of the what we call governance. There is some kind of steering group, management team, but also strategic advisory council, where very often we have some external stakeholders, some key figures from business, from research, for example. We have also what we call continuous entrepreneurial discovery process. I mentioned to you during my last presentation that for us, the strategy is co-created with business, with researchers, with civic society. During the process of the dialogue that we call entrepreneurial discovery process, this process has to continue during the implementation phase and comment and bring constant inputs on is it working or not, do we have to adjust, and so on. Obviously, if you implement a lot of different innovation projects, calls, and so on, there has to be some IT system that we can also use for monitoring and evaluation. We have to have governance system that not only includes internal government institutions or public institutions, but also some kind of joint work with external stakeholders. Communication, that was also mentioned. We have to, in a way, sell strategy, especially when it's first time designed to different stakeholders, also internally in the government. There is a lot of skills needed and a special type of capacity that I will also comment on today. And obviously this constant revision. If we design the strategy for a few years, sometimes like even now in the pandemic, very soon we discover that there is some other challenge we need to address, and we have to be prepared and understand what is happening and where some adjustments can be made. So just not to stay on the theoretical level too long, little bit more practical example prepared also by our experts. I'm trying to get rid of this black box, but I'm not very successful. How it can look in practice. Yeah, I told you about a few kind of levels of this governance structure for implementation. And those three boxes, red, green, and yellow, show the levels in a way, how we can organize it in practice. So there is the decision level. Yeah? Someone has to adopt both the strategy and the implementation plan that we have. Usually this is at the level of government by some kind of decree, by government decision that is taken up. And the decision-making process also is discussed in what very often for us is called Smart Specialization Steering Group that works closely with Strategic Advisory Council. Very often such a council for innovation, for example, or research is under Prime Minister or some of the Vice Prime Ministers. Then we have the interministerial team of the key ministries that have some kind of portfolio or mandate of to implement instruments that are necessary to promote STI in those interdisciplinary priority domains that we have in smart specialization. And obviously, sometimes we need the discussion of ministers, but sometimes operational people. So normally those ministries delegate some members to so-called management team that is operational. But what I wanted also to mention to you, I already said it in this previous slide, the continuous entrepreneurial discovery process. This part in yellow for us, it's a part of constant work with external stakeholders. We call for different priority domains of smart specialization. I will show you some examples what they can be on the next slide. We have inter-sectorial groups that are composed of representatives of private sector, of academia, of civil society, but also of public institutions. So for example, I gave you last time already one potential priority domain that was innovative agri-food products. Such a working group would be one of those yellow ones. It has coordinator, but also meets regularly to comment on the implementation of the strategy, of the new needs, of the needs maybe to adapt also. Always important elements are the ones that I already mentioned on the previous slide. all those people have to learn to work together. They need dedicated skills. They need a lot of communication. And obviously, with the bigger strategic programs and processes, we do need some systems to constantly review what's happening and to manage the IT system and to be able to understand what's changing. So practically, I took today one example from Central region in Portugal. I know that some participants speak Portuguese. Unfortunately, the full version of the strategy is not available in English, but I think it's pretty understandable anyway. Just to let you know, Portugal is in a way at the end of Europe. Central region is this one that I'm showing now with the cursor. And in general, this first summary fish shows at the country level what kind of areas Portugal decided to invest in the period 2014-2020 in terms of smart specialization priority domains. So you can see here agriculture, forestry and fishing, manufacturing and industry, sustainable innovation, human health and social work activities, and blue growth, because obviously they are on the ocean. And you can also see more or less the level of financing. The green part, 2.4 billion euro for the 7 years, comes from the EU, from structural funds. The rest, the orange part, comes from the national contribution. Those priority domains are obviously differing a bit in every region. And here, specifically for the central region, which is not one of the most developed in Portugal, Norte is the one that is really strong in terms of economic growth. You can see what they did. First of all, they identified those specific areas that are intersectorial in a way, such as agro-industry, sea, for example, health, and so on. But also they created kind of innovation platforms for collaboration of the different stakeholders that work on the horizontal solutions in a way. For example, technologies for quality of life or territorial innovation. In Portugal, it is worth mentioning that it's indeed very important. They use a lot of work with smart specialization to combat territorial inequalities. And also, they chose some transversal priority domains, such as internationalization, for example. For every example I give, I left you links also that you can really study in detail, but here it's more to show you the general idea how it works.
Monica, 3 minutes, please.
Oh my God, surely I'm not speaking already 12.
Yes.
So I have to go faster because there is a lot more to say. So here is the governance structure they designed for the region. They have coordination council, they have enlarged regional council, a strategic advisory group, and management team that works directly with each of the working groups for each priority domains. But also, it was mentioned in the previous presentations already, but this is an interesting example, this network that you can see here. During the implementation, when different policy instruments are being implemented, the regional government is monitoring all the time who collaborates with whom on specific projects. So here this network is in a way practical cooperation of regional actors, stakeholders, different companies from different areas, as you can see here. In this way, the regional government can monitor is this cooperation that we wanted to happen in the strategy really happening in practice when we implement different processes? Also, this is something they designed. I'm just quoting here, but you can see here the key elements they decided to be part of the implementation model of smart specialization strategy. What we mentioned already: communication, capacities, constant observation of different new opportunities, and then only resulting from that concrete projects or products of smart specialization, measurement of impacts, and different indicators. I won't go into detail here, but just to show you specifically how the actual implementation of specific projects looks. I was commenting on it already when we discussed the design of policy mix last time. You can see here that for very different strategic objectives they have, research, this is R&D in general, they have a lot of specific projects, industrial intellectual property, for example, demonstration projects, mobilization projects, and so on. And what they really observe and monitor all the time, how many applications they receive for each of those instruments and how many are in the end approved. And you can see that, for example, some of the plans they did originally put forward in the strategy, they don't have too many applications. So maybe during this constant revision, they need to be improved. And here, in terms of funding, you can also see that for actually innovation projects and companies, this is where most funding goes. For R&D, much less, for example. Then I also wanted to comment, following also some questions I received during the last session. This is the region. This is not the whole Portugal. This is only the region of Centro that I'm commenting to you. But please have a look how much they monitor also from where in the region the applications for different policy instruments that they have in the smart specialization strategies come from. Yeah? And you can see that there is some sub-regions or counties maybe that are much more active. Some of them hardly, maybe they even propose some projects, but they are not approved during assessment. So something is wrong, maybe more capacity building is needed. And here the same, I know it's not very visible, but just to give you an overview, they also check which exactly sectors, which priority domains of smart specialization, where the projects come from. And I think this is also pretty interesting. And yeah, and before Dimo tells me off, I just wanted to show you another much faster example from a non-EU country, from the country that is in the Western Balkans. It's Montenegro. It's a tiny country. And very often, even today on Mentimeter, when there was a question, what is the biggest obstacle for you or the biggest problem with implementation of STI policies, many people said funding or the coordination. So this is the country that the whole country has 700,000 inhabitants. So it's tiny, it has very little money, it's not super developed, and the smart specialization strategy was the first type of this kind of STI policy they ever implemented. Before, they had very kind of old model of research or scientific policy in general, with this big S, as someone mentioned today. And this is the government structure they came up with, the governance structure for implementation of smart specialization strategy. You can see that it's approved by Parliament, and specifically it is led by Committee of Education, Science, Culture and Sport. Then the government of Montenegro approves the strategy, but also is responsible for implementation. They launched a national office. This is this management structure, everyday management for smart specialization. You can see here also how many ministries have to cooperate to provide different instruments for implementation. They have the Council for Smart Specialization, which is those external figures, respected scientists, businessmen, and so on. Entrepreneurial discovery focus groups, and also the cooperation of the Science and Technology Park. They have centers of excellence, incubators, technology transfer offices, but also private sector and scientific research sector. I put here also, just for your information, what kind of priorities they chose: sustainable agriculture and food value chain, energy and sustainable environment, sustainable and health tourism, and ICT. And here, this is maybe for later reading, but I put a picture for you of one of what they call flagship initiatives for this first priority, for sustainable agriculture and food value chain. And you can see here that they very specifically said what they want to do, how they want to show they're really implementing this. And this is via biomapping and engineering project that has, as you can see, both research components for science sectors, but also innovation components, specifically what companies can do. And obviously for that, a funding is provided. Here, I also gave you an overview. This is more so, yeah, like maybe just if you are interested to have a look later on. This is the practical application of policy mix. So this is one of the objectives they have. This is not all objectives on the strategy, but one of them, supporting innovative activities in the business sector. Specific instruments they put together, what they mean, to which priority domains of smart specialization they apply, because not every instrument is relevant for all the priority domains that they chose. But also you can see here which ministry is responsible and who is the main target group of every policy instrument. Later on, this is for the same objective. You can see also the budget. Sometimes it's not so much money. The total for the budget of for the whole strategy, you can see here, this is millions of euro. Yeah, so they have 175,000 almost 75 million euro to implement the strategy. But you can see that for every single instrument, different ministries, Ministry of Science, Ministry of Education, Agriculture, and many others, they put sometimes even very small instruments, but they in a way contribute together to implement it. And finally, I think this is the last slide, but in the EU, obviously, we have implementation of smart specialization strategies already for many years, since 2014, with a lot of investment. The total investment in Europe, in the whole, all of member states, 27 member states of the EU, in the last period was 68 billion euro, 48 from European Commission and the rest from member states. Based on this experience, we did a research, a big Europe-wide survey, what management skills are most missing or most needed in the implementation of smart specialization strategies. And you can see here that more of the half of representatives of governments that are responsible for implementation, they still think they don't have enough skills. And you can see here which are the worst, or where they sorry, this is the bigger it means that they have more skills in that. So, for example, they are very good in project planning, in proposals evaluation, also with good English and so on. But the more practical you go, financial planning, for example, economic analysis, legal expertise, for example, for implementation, experience and ability to engage with international and intergovernmental networks, supporting competences, these are more and more missing, and this is something worth also reflection. Yeah, when we can design the best implementation structure ever, but if people are not comfortable and they don't know what to do exactly and how to work on those topics, it maybe just won't function. So this is just to have it in mind during implementation. Just this is the very last slide, I promise. We have. I just wanted to show you that honestly, when we go, if the further from Europe we go, we never know if our approach is useful and applicable. But I think my colleague Mafini is here with us today. We have discovered that in Africa, especially in Central Africa, there is a PRICNAC project. I put you also the name here so you can find it. That used the smart specialization principles to identify micro innovation projects in a way. And I put here some examples. I removed all the from whom and from which country they come from because it's confidential, but you can see what kind of innovation projects were proposed specifically from different African states. And this is the real spirit of smart specialization, because it's some mixing what we have, the traditional competences, traditional sectors, with new methods and innovation. Yeah. So, for example, food. This is in French, but I know that most people here have way better French than I do. But food security for local products, for example. So we need innovation to develop the protocols or how to make the authentic products more secure for consumption and maybe also for exports and so on. There is, for example, a telecardiology project for telemedicine and so on and so on. I won't be going into details into them, but just to show you that there is already some interest and some applications in specific countries. They are showed here in the slide where this is being experimented with, and we obviously are observing with great interest how it works and what we can do in the future. So yeah, some final conclusions from my side. I would say, looking what we did in Europe and beyond with our methodology, everyone puts an awful lot of effort in strategy design, and very often we are so tired later that we don't put so much time into implementation, which is crucial. Implementation needs a very specific set of skills which are different than the strategy design, and not only in the public sector, but also among the actors of innovation system. The governance of implementation is really a system of shared responsibilities, budgets, but also knowledge and information. And the key success factors are transparency, participation, and continuous learning. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Sorry if it was
No
long,
problem.
but it's really complex to explain. I must say, I always struggle how to say it shortly.
Monica, please stay on now. Despina,
Yeah,
can you please launch the Mentimeter question? We're going to have just one Mentimeter question as a follow-up. Okay, so what do you consider a missing element on the STI policy implementation in your country? Monica, you may want to comment as the answers come in. We'll give 3 minutes for the answers to come in. And
I see what's coming up already. Yeah, we have few answers, but leadership and coordination, they keep coming back, and this is indeed crucial. We always say, especially in the countries where the institutional capacity is in general lower, and we have also such in the EU, very often strategy has no face. Yeah, who is the leader? Who is the face of smart specialization or STI policy? Who really promotes it? And it doesn't always have to be only the government figure. Yeah, it very often the key business leaders, for example, or great scientists are great promotions. Coordination, I see. Yeah, we also see that problem. It looks very beautifully in theory, but very often, especially in countries that only started with smart specialization, and when we tell them you need interministerial smart specialization team, it takes them a year to decide which ministry should call the meeting, because then it means this ministry is more important. So this is also a key factor, but it's really worth. We see such good results. If you put effort in this coordination, it takes time. Sometimes it's super frustrating, but it really pays off. I really would encourage everyone to have a look. Yeah, regular review, monitoring and evaluation, design of the instruments. Yeah, I think we see that half of the answers at the moment out of 12 say leadership and coordination, really, no? And I can only say I fully agree. We have very similar problems, although maybe sometimes a different environment, and the design of policy instruments, we always say the devil is in the detail, no? And the good design of policy instruments is crucial. Yeah? For example, from the government perspective, if we have any budget for implementation, we want to spend it quickly because we need a success rate. Yeah, oh my God, we have so much money. Let's have big calls for big projects that are shiny, that we can have official opening, and it's amazing. But if those instruments are to push the implementation, like innovation projects in companies, especially in SMEs, those SMEs very often don't have capacity, financial capacity to implement a lot of money. They need small projects, which for us is a burden. So, for example, this is something in the design that we noticed in many countries. Yeah, monitoring and evaluation. This is always something we don't really know to learn the lessons learned, really. Yeah, if like we always say, you have to learn from failure, you have to understand what mistakes you made, but yeah, show me the minister who really wants to announce all the mistakes they made and how they will improve in the future. This is always a problem. Yeah, this is just politics. So I see that more or less we have equal understanding of leadership, coordination problems, design of policy, and monitoring and evaluation. No one has a problem with refinement of policy instruments. I don't know if it's because no one ever refines them or because it works so amazingly. But, yeah.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you for that very interesting presentation and the great discussion. Again, I think that many of us can find ourselves in so many of the things you said, but also for showing some ways forward in terms of policy design and implementation. With this, I pass the floor to Victor Conde. Victor, can you take over at this point and give us your best in 15 minutes, if this is possible? I'm very keen on your presentation, as I'm just submitting the Zambia STI Policy Review to our documents unit for publication. So I have one more day to change something in there, depending on your presentation. So Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think I'll try. And I'm not sure it will be helpful to you. Partly because I'll be talking about a very old policy. And I'll also be coming, I think, from slightly different angle than my colleagues have done. So whilst I agree with most of the issues, there are just a couple of reminders. One is that policy implementation, I think we can see from almost all the presentations that there's a struggle between, are we talking about implementation, or talking about monitoring, or talking about actually getting things kind of designed again. So to just, from where I'm coming, most of the stuff I'll talk about perhaps will be coming from what we've been doing. And some of you were with us yesterday and the other day. We're looking at our current policy implementation, policy formulation and implementation guide. So if you imagine that policy agenda setting to almost policy adoption is actually policy formulation, then the rest of it is really implementation, which is basically monitoring and evaluation as well. The problem is when all of you can remember when you were designing your policy, because you are all screaming, you want your thing in and holding a consultative meetings, and policy implementation is actually a very lonely stage. And I think someone has just mentioned that, and I just want to reemphasize it, that we tend to think someone now would do it. We made the policy and they are gonna do it, so we are designing actual policy for others. I think successful policy implementation requires that the people who will be implementing it are involved in the policy design. In any case, the policy often is someone wants that policy. Pick an issue, you can put a face to the policy. So basically some of our held assumptions that politicians make policy while bureaucrats implement it. I think that's wrong. I think actually everyone implements. You can all remember politicians that were hands-on implementing things in the field. Policies are good in design, but poorly implemented, perhaps not. Maybe they were already bad plans in the beginning. Now maybe they're just not realistic. It is also possible that policy, poor stakeholder engagement. I think sometimes we just don't define the stakeholders properly. Do they hold any stake or they don't? And finally, of course, the issue of fragmentation, duplication of efforts, or is it competition? I think there is always like, this is our mandate. Are we just trying to hold on to stuff, or is it because we're trying to avoid competition? Because in some cases, policies are implemented better if there is actual competition. Then there's the issue of policy and action, that if we codify it, action will be made. We have a lot of countries, including Kenya, where the policy has been in draft, and many of the things in the draft policy are actually already being implemented. So policy, the absence of policy does not necessarily mean the absence of action, and not every action we need needs policy. Maybe just also another reminder is simply we need to appreciate that implementation failure is something that is fairly not absolute. So even the worst policy that we think failed has some successes somewhere. And therefore, when we do judgments, we should just be a little bit careful. And the reason is very simple. In policy implementation, there's what we call self-implementing policies. So your government, for example, can decide that from midnight to night, the price of X is going up by so many percent. That happens immediately. We are going to close down the borders. That happens immediately. Policemen may actually enforce it or things, but that is almost self-implementing policies. So basically, you announce it, but the price of fuel will go up, and you actually is going to go up. And that happens to schools. In research and development, policy governments can literally say, we are banning the export of blood from human tissue. And that becomes self-implementing because literally immediately they say the ban has been put on, it's going to happen. And so in many of our policy documents, there are certain things that are actually self-implementing. And therefore, it is impossible that the policy completely failed. And not to mention, anyway, if the policy was adopted, there's a chance that one part of implementation, this adoption, making laws and acting them, and if many of them were actually done, so perhaps something happened. Then, of course, we need to manage political commitment, and everyone has said it. Here in Zambia, if there are any Zambians, they will remember when we were basically dragging Zambia onto the internet, which, by the way, was on the second country in sub-Saharan Africa to get on the internet. And basically, the president himself was literally involved, and the Minister for Health, and not necessarily the Minister for Science or the Minister for Education, but all these teams were meeting literally at the University of Zambia. And when the country got on the internet, the first email was actually sent by the president to the Queen. So you can understand what commitment actually meant. But you should also be careful because high political commitment may also actually lead to a lot of interference. So it's your job to manage it as opposed to just want it, because it can actually stand in the way. And immediately, I think Zamnit got into the brought internet to Zambia. A lot of pretty horrible rules came in that stopped others from developing their own internet service providers. And the cost of just getting on the internet, if you want to develop an internet service provider, went up, and they didn't pay anything. So in a way, people who are already there are a lot of vested interests. Then there's over-optimism. I think something that we often forget. We may set policies and say, okay, we want to end hunger. But do we even know how we're going to do it? How many people are hungry today? How quickly can we reduce that proportion in our countries? So one is sometimes policies are optimistic, and therefore we will say we failed. And of course, inadequate coordination has been talked about. I will not labor on that. And then the poor collaborative policy making and problem solving platforms. It's not enough to just say we coordinate, we meet once a week. There must be a platform where you will actually be solving problems when things go wrong. So when we are looking at the internet again in Zambia, we found like where they were busy sending messages to colleagues abroad or someone who runs, for example, the national telecom and say, hey, I have just pinged you, did you get it? How long did it take? Okay, something like this not working. Does someone know how to design this? At School of Engineering literally had to design an instrument for them. That is what today we call routers. And in a way, you can tell they had a platform for problem solving. The internet is cut, and like I think the late used to describe it with a bit of tape and tapes and wires. Actually, we managed to get on the internet. So in a way, policy implementation actually is a process of learning, but that process of learning happens if we have a platform where we can do it. And of course, in rapidly evolving political cycle, I think everyone has talked about it, so I'll just keep it. So this is about the Zambian National Science and Technology Policy of 1986. I didn't implement it. So that's one disclaimer, but I closely watched its implementation. And before I actually shared this, I shared it with someone who was closely really involved in its implementation to just make sure that some of my conclusions are not completely outrageous. So here are their goals: enhancing linkages between technology research institutions, the private sector, public sector, engage the demand-driven research and development. We can agree with that. Developing and sustaining a national scientific and technological capacity and providing highly skilled manpower, fostering national and international linkages for enhanced technology transfer, facilitating acquisition, adaptation, and utilization of foreign technology. Okay, but the broad policy objective was basically to embed science and technology in all key sectors for promoting competitiveness in the production of a wider range of quality goods and services, which are all the nice things you have all actually said. And it looked at gender consent, changing the institutional structure, ensuring research is guided by national development goals, establishing a mechanism to increase innovation, transfer and diffusion and commercialization of technology. So it all sounds good. And so what did we ask for in the policy? The main asks, because all the policies actually have an ask. One was to separate R&D from policy advice and commercialization. The other one, we asked that the Department for Science and Technology in the Ministry is actually established, that we establish a post for Science and Technology Advisor to the President, that we create Science and Technology Fund, Development Fund, and the Venture Fund, and introduce tax breaks for R&D, commercialization, and licensing, and tech inputs, allocate 3% of GDP to science and technology. By now, I think many of you must be thinking there's a problem. So what was accomplished? Okay, so a separate actually R&D, we separated R&D from the policy advice and commercialization that was done. There used to be the head of NISA, used to be also the advisor to the president, and was literally appointed by the president. But that now was separated to become specifically for R&D, the National Council of Science and Technology for Advice, and the National Technology Business Bureau for technology transfer and helping out with IP protection for those who don't have the resources. Then the department was established. The post of science advisor to the president, nope. Because that actually done for I don't know, unless you get the president actually to agree with you, he needs a policy advisor in that place. You are not going to force him to have one. And the second one is establish the Committee of Science and Technology in Parliament and Cabinets. Those actually do exist, just not sure how active they are. Then create Science and Technology Development Fund and Venture Fund, where some funds maybe do exist, but not the venture fund. I think there's some effort now trying to get a venture fund started again. And then, and of course, standalone fund. Then of course, introduce tax breaks for R&D, commercialization, licensing, and other tech inputs. I think most of those already existed. So there were no percentages that say it should be increased by this. They just say it bluntly. So if you look at foreign investment policies and the law and some of the regulation, you find a lot of exemptions. And they allocate 3% of GDP to science and technology, absolutely not, because I think last time they did the survey on R&D, Zambia was at 0.25%, if I'm not mistaken. I think I saw Mawoko is here, so he was part of he oversaw the first STI and better information than me. So is it poly implementation failed? Yes and no. So first of all, that's internal conflicts and interests. The case of science advisor, well, we stopped the person who is responsible, the head of NISA, from being the advisor to the president, but in the process, we actually lost any direct advice to the president from an independent person because we didn't get the new post either. So perhaps we should have kept it and then asked for another one. Then there's unclear mandates. So of course, the venture fund, for instance, is a good example of that. Neither the ministry nor the National Technology Business Center have any mandate. I don't think their current law actually allows them to run a venture capital fund. So unless the law is changed, we don't think they can either give loans nor take equity. So in a way, how do you run a venture capital fund? So again, maybe something that was left out. And then there's unreasonable asks. In the case of 3% of GDP, that's about Zambia's, I think that the entire budget for the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education. And we're asking it for R&D. I don't think anyone will ever give it to us. Even if they gave it to us, our R&D system is so small, I'm not sure where we're going to put it. Then, of course, they're missing the changing economic, political, and technological environment. During the time when the policy was being enacted, I think everyone forgot Zambia was privatizing, and the STI policy was asking for more government involvement. So you can understand why they kind of tug of war. ICT was growing, but it got less attention in the policy. And it is extremely inward looking. So basically, we don't have many friends out there wanting to work with us. So my other main, maybe when we look at implementation, first, it's a lonely step and happens late. Perhaps we should really make sure that everyone who is involved in policy design is happy to be there in policy implementation. They have signed up. I think everyone has already said that. We assumed it to be a logical progression, and the answer is no. You're basically during implementation, there's a lot of learning, a lot of refinement, new things will happen that you didn't put up in the policy. And the case of the internet, mobile, biotech, all of them, I think, became hot issues that perhaps were not really much in the policy. The links between goals and the planned actions. The embedding science and technology in key sectors, how does that go to do with the establishment of institutions? This direct linear link doesn't exist. So what is, maybe we should have focused on the outcomes, what did we want to achieve, as opposed to what institutions we should have. And then of course, implementation always brings new issues on the agenda. Things never go as planned. It doesn't matter whether you're trying to cook your best meal, something always go wrong, one bean would jump out of your pot or something. And of course, there's blaring distinction between policy formulation and implementation, because like I said earlier, there's a lot of self-implementing, I think, policy actions. Then, of course, a common thing that I want to mention, a common understanding is important. This is a question of technology transfer, and this is actually from Ghana, Kenya, Zambia. Then we ask the R&D heads of institutions. And you can see in one area, I think, a number of the countries in general say their research may not be relevant, but when it comes to the heads of R&D institutions, not a single one ever said their research was not relevant, which means you're actually not really having a common understanding in many of other areas. And this is just on technology transfer. So I'm sure if we look at the entire policy, we did a comprehensive policy assessment, and we also found that there's a huge differences by the seniority, sometimes even by discipline. So perhaps we need to focus a little bit more on that. And with that, I thank you, and I think we've left you with 20 seconds.
Thank you so much, Victor. You are really an able presenter and managing to concentrate all these very interesting messages in your presentation. I would like to now invite the participants. There's a Mentimeter up. I think Despina will put it up right now. Let's take about 2 minutes to do this Mentimeter. Victor, if you would like to comment. So I've put up this question: what is the major cause of STI policy implementation failure in your country? One option. So let's give it a go, everyone, and see how people feel about this. Yeah, Zambia was a very peculiar case. A lot of goodwill, but and a lot of understanding. Very vibrant business sector. I don't think this is one of the places where I think the private sector could play a much bigger role naturally and without so much hesitation. It's a very interesting case. I will send you the link of our policy review as soon as it's out, Victor. Perhaps you'll find this interesting, and maybe you could use it to adjust your presentation as well. But I think 95% of what we said overlaps very much so with what was in your presentation. So in that sense, I'm a bit relieved to say, that we found very similar things. Victor, what do you think about the responses so far? It seems to be a very
yes, I can see. I think there is actually. I did this. The suggestions were deliberate. Basically, I made suggestions that I'm going to go against, which is, I think everyone said, why the stakeholder apathy? Sure, but if you left me out when you are doing the design and then you show up during implementation and say, hey, you are supposed to do this, and I'm wondering, why am I working with you? You didn't ask me what I wanted. For example, I mean, like you said, we looked at when we were doing. When I came back from UNCTAD at the time after this policy was adopted, we worked with a lot of business and business linkages, which was my last assignment in Geneva. And most of them don't even remember that we have an STI policy. And we looked at with Donovan, we worked with Airtel, and if they don't know, then who does in the private sector?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we have a problem. So stakeholder apathy, yes, but with who stakeholder, perhaps the one in the public sector, maybe we should also engage them. And I think we did have part of that with colleagues in the ministry a couple of times, that they should not look at only the institutions that fall under the ministry. Literally every institution they wanted to strengthen, they wanted to fund, they wanted to support is inside the ministry. How about the ones outside that actually cause, maybe could, like someone said, could actually bring greater gains to Zambia in terms of science and technology? Shouldn't they be included, like areas where we want to get support? Fragmentation of efforts, yes, it's always a problem everywhere. But I think Zambia has a lot of experience when they're doing the Rainbow Project. All the permanent secretaries were reporting to the President's Office or State House every month. So why don't we do the same for STI policy? So we need to get it to that higher level. We can, I think perhaps we were arguing yesterday, or I think the other day, in our meeting with the experts, that perhaps we should make STI almost like a national development tool, as opposed to be a technology focus. It's why we're saying, okay, well, maybe we need to develop a particular sector, particular skill sets. Morocco has done that with the aeronautics engineering, and now they export. When they started, everyone said they were crazy. Morocco will never make it, and they have.
Yes.
I see Annalyn has a question.
So yes, Annalyn, please go ahead with your question. Okay.
Thank you, Timo, and thank you to Victor for great presentation indeed. Always good to listen to Victor's presentations. Maybe Victor, how would you explain the changing ministries over the past 3 to 4 years? As you know, Zambia experienced like 3 to 4, even 5 maybe, change of ministries in terms of where science and technology is located, and it kept on changing like 5 times. and how this has affected policy implementation, but also the policy direction in the country, because I think it has impacted on negatively on the system, the continuous changing of the ministry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, the ministries was change. I think every political party that comes to power, I think most changes happen when we change the political parties. And Zambia is one of those that has a tendency of wiping out an entire government and bring a new one. And the current new government that came in had just brought back the Ministry of Technology and Science, so kind of disorienting. But what we thought was that if you have the Department of Science, and suppose it is worth in almost like has its own funding and its own human resources, then it may start give you some stability. Then assuming that department also has, I think, with strong linkages with, for example, with Parliament, then it can give you some stability. But yes, the changing of ministries, in fact, it's not even the changes in the ministries. I think at one time, Zambia was changing the ministers responsible for science and technology, I think faster than shops. I think that was the time we keep track.
There is a new one now.
My colleagues are here, so I don't know. I didn't work for the ministry, but I can understand many issues may have fallen off. But a lot of the institutions that were developed are almost independent, like the National Technology Business Center can run without the ministry. In fact, it's not even located inside the ministry. It's actually located in the what we call the government building, where a lot of other ministries, Ministry of Industry and Trade and others are located. And the Ministry of Science and Technology is literally somewhere else. So those should be able to function independently. Some of them also have their own boards. The National Council for Science and Technology should be able to also kind of work independently. If there's one institution that the last policy killed, it's NISA, the National Institute for Scientific and Industrial Research. We looked at it, it has fewer people, less money than it had in 1970.
I don't know, Victor, if you know that, but there is a new ministry. It's called the Ministry of Technology and Science now, as after the elections. And thankfully, the staff that are running the science and technology, the STI department and the Ministry of Higher Education are now in the Ministry of Technology and Science. So there is some continuity there. And in some way, it will be interesting to see what happens because the minister there is the ex-minister of Commerce and Industry and ex-minister of Finance. So should be a very well-connected politician, and I hope that they will be able to work together in promoting the STI work and mandates. I have two questions on the chat for both Monica and Victor. The first one is from Remy. It says, how can government officials, politicians be guided to draw the lines between policies which are self-implementing and those that are not? And the second one is an even more general question, and that is, what is the logical way of estimating global expenditures on research and development? Most of the targets for global expenditure on research and development in many countries are unrealistic. Monica, would you like to take one or either of the questions, or
Sure.
both?
Yeah, maybe I quickly comment on two of them. On the first one, yeah, thank you, Remy, for that question. I would say maybe that, okay, I can only say from my experience, which is really in the STI domain and especially in smart specialization and the kind of industrial policies a bit with clusters and so on. So I cannot say for health policies, for example, or others. But from all I saw in my domain, I would say there is no self-implementing policies really, unless you really have societies with super high social control. That I remember we always laughed on such example that my country is known for a high level of car accidents in the roads. And we heard one year that in Sweden, the number of car accidents grew a lot in 1 year. So Prime Minister went on national TV and said to everyone, you must drive more carefully because we have too many accidents. And the next year, the number of accidents fell because everyone listened to Prime Minister. In the country that I come from, which is Poland, it just doesn't work like that. And I think in most other countries. So in that way, there is no self-implementing policy in my understanding, especially in STI. It's always, unfortunately, hard work. But I think that those lines that you mentioned in your question, it's important to draw them more in a way that people know what they're supposed to do. So, for example, this high-level leadership, sometimes it's really enough that from time to time, be it minister or prime minister or someone important in the government says, this is important, please do it, I want it done. And then people feel empowered in a way and mandated to use their own sense in a way to implement the policy, but obviously they need to feel supported in that effort. Yeah, they need to know if they propose good solutions, there will be budget for it, they will be maybe, I don't know, promoted and so on. Yeah, but normally it's a lot of work, a lot of thinking, a lot of consultation, a lot of dialogue. I wouldn't think that we have any really self-implementing ones. And on GERD, maybe the question, I'm not sure if the question is about statistical methods or setting targets, but I can comment maybe one thing that we saw in Africa. I mentioned on my last presentation that we are preparing next year to have more cooperation, especially with Sub-Saharan Africa, to work a little bit more on STI roadmaps for SDGs and so on. And we were trying to find a way, some criteria, how to choose potential partners to whom we could approach. And one indicator that was proposed, also actually by my colleague who is here, it was that the countries we work with have to have at least this much interest in research and innovation that they have one data point on STI, on R&D expenditure, for example, or any one data point in the recent years. And I don't know, I think at least half of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa didn't fulfill this criteria. So I think for the statistic, I'm not a statistician, so I want to guide you exactly how to count it. There is a lot, there's UNESCO colleagues here, I think statistical offices can help in that, but it's really important to show this interest, to have basic data on your STI system in general. And then to set targets, yes, I agree. They are very often unrealistic. And I think it's much better to set a lower target, but then to really consider in the government what we can do to meet this target, then to put something up that everyone will be maybe saying, yeah, that's very ambitious, but will never happen. But I think the major problem is actually the availability of research and innovation statistics as such. How can you do a good policy if you don't understand how your system works? Yeah, this is for us crucial. And I can only mention to you, I mentioned today in my presentation the example of Montenegro. They didn't have actually proper they had research statistics when they started working with us, but not innovation statistics. And it was we want to have a strategy to promote innovation activity of companies and what we just don't know if they are innovative at all. So what we did with them, it was not really smart specialization as such. We did it in cooperation with other institutions, but we helped them to develop innovation statistics. And after it's a long process. After 2 years of testing with European Statistical Office, they are now included in what we call European Innovation Scoreboard that compares the European Union member states and the innovation performance. And Montenegro is one of the first countries beyond EU was able to also develop statistics good enough to be included in those comparisons. So it is super important for any good STI policy. And if I was a Minister of Science, it would be my major priority, honestly speaking, before even establishing a strategy, I must say.
Victor, any comments from your side?
Yes.
On these two questions?
Well, so
Please.
there are two ways of looking at policy making. There are times you set a target because you want to beacon something, and you are, even when you are sure you may not meet it, but you want to kind of like wave to the world, we would want to be here. I think the EU set up a target for R&D expenditure that they didn't meet either. However, it is if your target is so far, it may also be discouraging in the sense that everyone kind of get frustrated on the way that they're still not meeting it. We said we'll do this and we're not doing it. Kenya, for example, has it in the law that actually the treasury literally will give almost, I think, 2% of their GDP to the fund, and they haven't done it, even when it is in the law. So in a way, that is why, but that target is still great to have. So let the targets be ambitious, but a little bit realistic. Then there are those targets that are kind of like a political interest. For example, when the president, let's say, says we'll get every child a laptop. You can understand why there's so much interest in it, because he is actually talking about, or she's talking about it at political rallies and things like that. Or we're going to produce our own vaccines, or nowadays everyone's making our own electric cars. So you can understand that even when they don't have actually an actual real policy written on the issue, it becomes almost policy in the way that everyone actually starts rallying around it, that this will get done. And then the public will hold the president almost personally responsible if it's not happening, and he or she is going to make sure the people working for him deliver on those. So if I'm going to, so one advice I was given by my teacher is always try not to give advice that is so far away from your target, because if someone actually agrees with you and then they tell you, let's go and do it, and then you fail, you literally disappoint the person, or you disappoint the institution. In this case, we actually disappoint the country. So that's one. Self-implementing policies actually do exist. I mean, there are so many of them in law and in economics. And in science and technology, it's really the issues around legal issues in science and technology tend to be self-implementing. Because once it's passed, there's nothing much you can do. This is it. You are not going to create a new post. For example, a new institution you want to pass. The law went and it's been passed by parliament. Well, that's it. In many cases, it becomes literally binding for the country to pass, to build that institution. Now, in some kind of cases, of course, governments can argue their way out and not do it. So even self-implementing policies don't necessarily mean no person will be involved in implementing it. It's just that once it is announced, like when you say petrol prices will go up tonight, what more of some petrol stations, if they are happy to at the lower price, of course they can keep on selling, but most of them perhaps are likely to definitely raise the prices. But also when you say prices go down, you really want them to go down, because if they find you, you may end up in court or in prison. So in a way, we call those almost like self-implementing policies, because we actually try to make it and it will happen by itself. And in those issues to do with law happened a lot, I think.
Thank you, Victor. Annelien, you raised your hand, please.
Yes, thank you, Dimo. I think that's a very interesting discussion, because implementation is the biggest challenge that we face with. I think I want to follow up on Monica's comments on statistics and data. I think that's our biggest challenge and weakness in Africa, but also in the SADC region. And that's why we are working very closely with UNIATT, and I'm happy to see Mr. Seke is again connected today. It's important that we strengthen our data and our statistics to inform our policy development. Because if you look at the current policy process of developing science and technology policy or innovation policy, it is not informed by data or statistics. The data and statistics comes afterwards, post the policy. And I think we need to start changing that around. And I'm happy to say we'll be doing this in the DRC in partnership with UNIATT and some partners, where we will do some data collection and statistics, and then that will inform the innovation policy for the DRC. So this is one pilot we'll be doing in the next coming months. But I think what Monica said is very important. And I think would be happy if she can share also the case study of Monterrey, which he mentioned, just to us to see that as a case study. Thank you.
Thank you, Annelien. There's one more question. I think we'll wrap it up with that. It says the question is from Mina. Monica said there's a difference between research data and innovation data. What is the difference? Monica, please, very briefly.
Yeah, Yeah, I also want to thank Annelien for her comments. Yeah, and I agree. This effort is crucial. And commenting on the research and innovation data, research normally for us, at least in European statistics, data on research is usually includes or expenditure on research programs, projects done by scientific sector, also sometimes includes expenses on higher education, for example. We have also so-called BERT statistics, which monitor activities, research and development activities run by companies, normally bigger companies. So, but in general, it's about about making science, about costs of making science and how much government or different public institutions spend on that. Innovation data is very often for us in economic statistics, actually, where you analyze business, economic activities of businesses, and we also have what we call also manual, which explains in particular how you measure innovation activities of companies. And this is for us data on innovation, and it distinguishes product innovation, process innovation, organizational innovation, marketing innovation, and specifically there's a set of questions you can answer, but they are measured also statistically on representative samples in the national economy per sector and so on. So very often for smart specialization, we, for example, distinguish in which areas, in which scientific domains and disciplines the research is made, and but where businesses invest, in which business sectors there is innovation activity happening, and very often they don't match. And this is one of big problems we try to solve in smart specialization approach. It is really simplifying it a lot, but as quick as I can.
Thank you, Monica. I think we've had a slightly longer session than usual, so I thank everyone, the participants, and as well the presenters for their patience and very passionate inputs. I think it was longer because everyone is concerned very much with this issue. It is a critical and crucial issue. We will have a few questions regarding to the feedback about the session in the chat. Please try to answer these questions. They're very valuable for us. They help us make each successive session better than the previous one. So big thanks for your feedback. My colleague Despina will put the links on. And before we close, let me just, my impressions, what I learned from listening to my colleagues and friends in the past 2 hours. My first takeaway is that a well-designed STI policy does not mean automatically a well-implemented policy, and that means that we sometimes overinvest ourselves in the design part, whereas when it comes to implementation, we don't realize what we are up against. Following on this, we need to understand that the implementation part of the policy work is a completely different task than the design. It requires a completely different set of perspectives, skills, competencies, and actions. We need to realize that the complexity of implementation is immense, in particular as there are many policy instruments, but as well many stakeholders who are involved in this type of activity. And in order to do it successfully, we have to keep learning as we go in the implementation. Whether we call this learning from failure or learning from experience, it's about the same thing. It means energizing virtuous policy learning cycle so that each successive policy cycle is improved with the experience from the previous one. And of course, as now has been discussed, these indicators and so forth, there is a key role for monitoring and evaluation, and monitoring and evaluation is to a large part based on quantitative and measurable indicators. And that is actually going to be the subject of tomorrow's session, to which I hope you will all be present. So in closing, let me thank Annelien and the SADC team, as well as the UNESCO team in Harare for supporting the session. And of course, let me thank all the participants who have been patient and attentive and posed a lot of interesting questions. So thank you very much. I close on my part. I will give Annelien the floor for final comments and the closure of this session. Thank you very much, colleagues and friends, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Dimo. Once again, it's such an it was such an exciting session. I think we are sad that we're having the last session tomorrow. It's been very an insightful week of information flow, information exchange, but also learning new concepts and learning new things. We also hope that at the end of the workshop tomorrow, we're able to get some sort of a report on all the answers and questions from the Mentimeter. We hope you guys will be able to generate and share with us. But thank you very much to all the presenters for session 4 today. Tomorrow we have session 5, which is the last session. And again, the participation has been very good. We still at the increased numbers, and I'm sure tomorrow it will even be the same numbers that we've been experiencing since the beginning of the week. Thank you so much.